Okay, so good morning to everyone. We start now with the second panel of the day, which is dedicated to the issue of the situations of vulnerabilities of victims of trafficking and exploitation. And I will present a certain overview of the main VULNER's projects results and findings related to this issue, which is within the work package number 10 dedicated to the issue of trafficking. And so after my presentation, I will hand the floor over to three discussants. I'm very happy to have them with us. So we have Maria Grazia Giammarinaro. She's been a judge since 1991, and she's the former UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking. She's adjunct professor of human rights law at the Irish Centre of Human Rights, and she is a well-known international expert on trafficking and exploitation-related issues. Then we have Suzanne Hoff. She is the international coordinator of Strada International, the European NGO platform against trafficking in human beings. And the aim of Strada International is to prevent trafficking and exploitation in Europe and to protect the rights of trafficked and exploited people. She, before Strada International, she worked for different NGOs, including Caritas Netherlands and then the Dutch Refugees Council, focusing on human rights and the rights of migrants. And then we have Enrico Somaglia. He is the Deputy General Secretary of EFAT, so the European Federation of Food, Agriculture and Tourist Trade Unions, and also representative domestic workers. EFAT is a recognized EU social partner and is member of HETUC, the European Trade Union Confederation. So thank you for being here. I'm very happy to have all of you here also to share different perspectives on this topic. So I think it would be great also to share these different perspectives, including anti-trafficking perspective, but also the perspective of trade unions. So, as I was saying, this presentation is focused on the VULNER project's results concerning the issue of the vulnerability of victims of trafficking and exploitation. And in particular, what we tried to do was to think about how are the situations of vulnerability of victims of exploitation and trafficking being addressed by national legal and policy protection systems? What are the main challenges in addressing, in recognizing their situation of vulnerability? And what are the links, if any, between the anti-trafficking and the asylum systems? And the analysis of this presentation is based on some questionnaires that addressing the VULNER teams, and that the VULNER teams, each team within the VULNER project, fill them out building on the data that I collected through interviews with the main national stakeholders. And for this specific presentation, I will focus on the data collected in particular in Italy, Belgium, and Norway. So let's start to say really few words, on the theoretical framework on which this work and this presentation is based. Because it's important to consider that when we consider the issue of exploitation and trafficking, we cannot avoid of facing those dominant narratives and discourse, including legal and policy discourse, considering exploitation only as connected to a dimension of contingency and exceptionality, to be read only through the dichotomy victims and exploiters, and only requiring criminal law responses. So in contrast to this view, in our work, we consider exploitation in its systemic dimension and in its pervasive character as a structural element of contemporary capitalistic system. And this is important because looking at exploitation from this perspective means considering it, as you see, as a structural continuum, which include, of course, minor and major labor law violation, but also severe forms of exploitation, including trafficking. So what we have stressed and highlighted in our work is that along this continuum, you have different forms of situational vulnerability. And here is the other concept. Of course, I don't want to go back to the theoretical debate that we have already addressed yesterday, but what I want to stress here is that when we talk about what we can define a sort of schizophrenic approach in legal discourses to vulnerability, I would say that the use of the legal notion of vulnerability in relation to trafficking is emblematic of this schizophrenic approach. And this is why we can see in most national legislation on trafficking and migration, but also in the EU law, that victims of trafficking are part of that list of the categories of vulnerable subjects. So according to a categorical approach, they are considered vulnerability as something fixed, static, right? But at the same time, the same national legislation and EU law pay attention to the dimension of, to the contextual dimension of vulnerability. And this is clear, for instance, in the definition of position of vulnerability that we found in the EU directive number 36 of 2011, defining a position of vulnerability in relation to the abuse of a position of vulnerability of a victim, pay attention to the context in which that specific person that is exploited is based. And it is actually this approach, so we really focus on what is called the situational dimension of vulnerability. That is the approach that we focus on. So pay attention to the person, to the people's position in society, in power relations, and that means pay attention to the interplay of personal and structural factors that create that situation of vulnerability. So building on this theoretical framework, looking at both, so sensitive to the complexity of exploitation as a continuum, including trafficking, and to the complexity of the situation of vulnerability of the people trafficked and exploited, we then first focus on the first issue, identification. And what clearly emerges is that key national stakeholders, including policy officers, judges, prosecutors, administrative decision makers, often do not cooperate among themselves in the identification process. And what is also found is that most stakeholders, and this is really clear, for instance, in Italy, are not really aware of the complexity of the dynamics of exploitation, which, as I said, also include trafficking, forced labor. So there is not this knowledge about the complex view on exploitation. And of course, in this context, as you probably already know, the identification of undocumented migrants is particularly challenging. So this is something that, of course, came out in all VULNER countries. Indeed, when intercepted by authorities, and that means, for instance, during labor inspections, but also anti-trafficking operations carried out by law enforcement, undocumented migrants are often subjected to immigration control, detained, and repatriated without being informed of their rights as a potential victims. There is also the risk, which is something that came out in some of VULNER, really clear in some of VULNER countries, the risk that exploited, trafficked people might be criminalized, and might be criminalized for illegal entry, for working as a sex workers, or for illegal activities. Even these were committed as a consequence of the fact of being trafficked or exploited. And of course, this is connected, and this is something that we stress in our report, to the fact that the non-punishment principle is not implemented in a correct way. Then the second point that we addressed is how is these situations of vulnerability assessed by relevant actors. And what we found is that in many countries, the evaluation requests for protection is often affected by stereotypes, including gender stereotypes, and that in a way depict the idea or the model of the perfect victim considered as a passive subject without agency. This is something that, for instance, clearly emerged in Italy, but at the same time, Italy is one of the country where we can stress that there has been an important case law developments on pay attention to that situational dimension of vulnerabilities of victims, especially in this case, this mainly concern Italian case law on complementary protection, such as former humanitarian protection, now called special protection. But still is very relevant as a case law development. Another point that I want to mention regarding the Italian context is that Italy is one of the few countries that has implemented a coordination, a referral mechanism between anti-trafficking and asylum system, which actually has the result, the consequence of this referral mechanism has been that to provide many persons, victims of trafficking, with adequate assistance. There are also some limitations in this mechanism. I don't have now the time to focus on, but if you're interested, I will be happy to address these issues during the debate. Then the second point that we have to stress is the issue of assistance. And what clearly emerges from our work is that many people do not receive adequate assistance and support, and in particular, national intervention are often unable to address gender-related issues, and in particular, the needs of people with different gender identities. And here also considering, for instance, the issue of accommodation of people with different gender identities, which is something that clearly came out in many of VULNER countries. Another point that we also stress is how the needs concerning family-related issues have been addressed. And for instance, in Italy, one of the main issues that we have found is the complicated situation of vulnerability of women victims of trafficking having their children with them. And in this case, what we have stressed is that the criteria with which associations, but also judges, consider and evaluate the parenting, the mothering skills, often do not really take into account their needs, so the needs of the women, and in particular the complexity of the factors that create their specific situation of vulnerability. So there are still, for instance, right now in Italy, there are many cases of women victims of trafficking and exploitation that have been separated from their children. Another point related to assistance, which is something that clearly emerges in many countries, is the fact that outside the asylum procedure, assistance or receiving assistance, support, and a residence permit as a victim of trafficking or other severe forms of exploitation, including forced labor, almost always requires cooperation with relevant authorities involved in criminal proceedings. So that means basically that rather than pay the attention to the rights of that specific person and putting the rights at the center, the rights of the protection of the person are subordinated and instrumental to the criminal proceedings. So that means the criminal law approach. And related to this is the fact that in many countries, including for instance Italy, the residence permits for victims of trafficking are mostly temporary. So that means that those people who receive them have few possibility to gain a long-term legal status. That means they have few possibility to build a new alternative life in a long-term perspective. I go back to this point later. An interesting exception that I want to stress here, although is of course part of the within the criminal law and criminal proceedings approach, is the fact that in Belgium there is the possibility for victims of trafficking and forced labor to receive a long-term residence permit. In Italy, we have a sort of considered good model in this regard. Because Italian legislation actually provides victims of trafficking and exploitation with the possibility to have assistance and a residence permit, irrespective of their cooperation in criminal proceedings. So this is considered a good practice, a good model, and in this system, anti-trafficking NGOs and associations play a crucial role in terms of identification and support of victims, but this is in theory, because in practice, the Italian system is not implemented in an adequate way, so that means that most of victims are still required to cooperate with authorities within criminal proceedings. The last point that I want to mention is the access to remedies. This is something that was emerged very clear in all the countries that we have analyzed, and is the fact that victims have no access to adequate compensation and remedies, and that means also that there are not effective channels, for instance, for exploited workers to obtain unpaid wages, which is element which is quite dangerous, and I would like to focus more on this during the debate if there is the time. So in conclusion, what we stress in our report is that what clearly emerges in most of the countries that we have analyzed is almost the absence of a comprehensive and effective coordinate approach that really understands, recognizes, and address the complexity of exploitation of victims of trafficking and understand the complexity of their situations of vulnerability. What we have stressed is a prevalence of a criminal law approach and the fact that the rights, as I said before, of victims of exploited and trafficked people are totally subordinated in most of the country to a criminal law approach, and so to criminal proceedings. In our text, we have provided some recommendations for key policymakers. Here, I would like to stress just some of this. And first of all is, of course, the need to create a coordinated system for the identification and assistance of exploited and trafficked people. And that means also involving all relevant actors, including trade unions. So I'm very happy that we have Emilio Somaglia with us, because I really think that trade unions can play an important and fundamental role in this. Then it's, of course, necessary, as I stressed many times during my presentation, in my opinion, to separate the provision of assistance and the residence permit to victims of trafficking from their involvement in criminal proceedings, but putting their rights at the center of the intervention, adopting a social and human rights approach. Then it's necessary to ensure the correct application of the non-punishment principle. So to make sure that people are not punished and criminalized for their involvement in illegal activities that are a consequence of the fact they have been trafficked or exploited. And last point, which I think is the most important point, is the fact that to really address and prevent situation of trafficking and exploitation, what is necessary is to provide people with an alternative. That means an alternative, a concrete alternative in terms of building a life project and in terms of having a job that is not in exploitative condition. Only within this approach, which provides people with a long-term perspective, we can really think about to address the root causes of dynamics of trafficking and exploitation. Thank you so much. Okay, so now I'm going to open this up to the discussants. So we start with Maria Grazia Giammarinaro. You prefer to come here or stay?
Thank you, Letizia, for the presentation and for this invitation, which gives me the opportunity of an exchange, even beyond maybe the VULNER project, and building on the suggestions and recommendations coming from this project. Vulnerability. I've heard the inspiring presentation of Professor Hathaway yesterday, and I would like to underline that vulnerability, as this concept has been used in the VULNER project, and myself, Letizia Palumbo, have tried to elaborate over the past years, is actually a sort of entry point to build social protection measures and allocate rights regarding people that not meet the requirements of the Geneva Convention. So it is an entry point to build an additional system to ensure not necessarily the same level of rights as enshrined in the refugee system, but at least to build some social protection measures for migrants, for vulnerable migrants, following the indications of the UN Global Compact on migration. And of course, to use this concept like this, it is important to understand how this concept, first of all, how this concept should be understood from a theoretical point of view. I don't repeat what Letizia said a few minutes ago. So it's not a substantial concept linked with women, according to a traditional patriarchal conception of women as vulnerable persons in nature. Not necessarily linked with the categorization of specific groups, but rather a concept which values the intersection of structural and personal factors, objective factors, so a concept that can be objectively appreciated and interpreted. This idea of vulnerability can be useful to evaluate the current trend of legislation. I mean that in the Italian legislation there was an additional protection system. Letizia mentioned that was the humanitarian protection, which was an additional path compared to refugee status and subsidiary protection. And of course, vulnerability was one of the grounds of a humanitarian protection. And another important ground was the level of integration into the Italian society. So the humanitarian protection was based, the evaluation was based on a comparative analysis of the situation of the person in case of return and the situation of the person concerning their social integration in the Italian society, family relationships, education, and work. Of course, you know that the humanitarian protection was replaced by the so-called special protection, which was much more fragmented than the humanitarian protection, and lately the far-right government in Italy didn't manage to delete completely the special protection. They tried very hard. But they deleted the part of the provision exactly concerning this comparative analysis of the situation of the person in case of return and the situation of the person in the Italian society. We will see how the law resulting from this deletion will be interpreted, because we support the idea that according to constitutional and international obligations of Italy, this provision should continue to be interpreted in a way that values the social integration of the person in the Italian society. But we will see what will be the outcome of this new legislation. What I would like to underline in this context is that the concept of vulnerability is already included in the EU legislation. We can build on this especially regarding the abuse of a position of vulnerability, and try to understand what is the further, how we can go further. What is the current situation? The current situation is that we have the asylum system, and we have, in general terms, I don't talk about Italy any longer, but about the European context, and we have the anti-trafficking system. Of course, what we should achieve is to enlarge the area of people entitled to social protection compared to what is now the area of people identified as victims of trafficking, which is a minority of real victims of trafficking, and as basically nothing compared to the area, a broader area of exploitation, be it sexual exploitation or labor exploitation or other forms of exploitation. From this point of view, what is essential is what is included in the recommendation, the disconnection between the legal qualification of a crime, the legal qualification of a person as a victim of trafficking human being, and the entitlement to measures accompanying the person. And of course, from this point of view, the current discussion on the revision of the directive, of the EU directive on trafficking, is basically a lost opportunity, because the main interest showed by the Commission is to make binding the provision on the criminalization of users. This is what the Parliament will for sure approve, maybe even in a worse formulation, because there is a discussion about deleting the expression knowingly use of services provided by trafficked persons, so that the penal provision will become really broad. But what we are trying to achieve is that the Parliament will, because the Parliament could do it, compared to the proposal of the Commission, the Parliament could adopt a broader approach and open the discussion on further amendments regarding exactly victims' rights. But the disconnect between criminal proceedings, the qualification of the crime, the qualification of the person as a victim of crime, and social protection, of course, needs elaboration and needs the establishment of a new system concerning grounds and concerning decision-making. This is not for sure something that can be done entirely in the context of the revision of the directive on trafficking, but is a possible outcome of the VULNER project in terms of designing new policies. What I want to say is that what can be the system to identify, I don't like the word identify, to recognize that there is a situation which requires social protection and a kind of support, not only economic support. What are the grounds? The grounds, if it is not the legal qualification of the person as a victim of crime, it could be her or his vulnerability. I say it could be because it is not to taken for granted that this is the only pathway. A second pathway could be exploitation, ground of exploitation, in a broader terms compared to what exploitation is considered in the context of trafficking or forced labor. And I finish by saying that the decision-making is also part of this, idea of a new system of protection. Of course, the decision-making in this context shouldn't be left to immigration authorities, but should be attributed to multidisciplinary teams. It should be made in a context of a multi-agency approach to evaluate the situation of the person, to evaluate their intersectional vulnerabilities and the situation of exploitation, and identify, this time the word is appropriate, tailored solutions to what is essential, which is accommodation, which is an alternative job, non-exploitative job, and in a gender perspective, the possibility to build a life, a migration project, which is not based on gender stereotypes concerning, for example, the type of work or the type of education. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Maria Grazia. Thank you for sharing this insight, and also really you really put the attention on one of the main issues, which is really that to think about how to rebuild the system, puts the social and human rights approach on this, and considering how to build this involve with different actors that, as she said, should act in terms of evaluate, recognize situation of vulnerability, or, as you said, grounds of exploitation, indicators of exploitation. That can be another path. So now I give the floor to Suzanne Hoff. You prefer to stay there, or? Thank you.
Even though I'm also quite small for a Dutch person. Yes, thank you very much. I could not be here yesterday because I was actually attending the General Assembly of PICAM, the Platform for International Cooperation on Undocumented Migrants, which is going on today and yesterday. And I must say a lot of the discussions I hear here were also happening yesterday. And thanks very much for inviting me. I might have a little bit more practical view on the issue, even though we work a lot with academics. We also do academic research sometimes ourselves. But I come from La Strada International, which is an umbrella organization of NGOs. We have 51 members in 24 European countries, 2 members in Belgium, Pacassa and Pajoca. And so we look at the issue much more from the practical point of view. Who can we assist on those issues? Our members, very shortly, directly assist trafficked persons with assistance programs, with helplines, prevention programs, and also, of course, with advocacy, both at national level and EU level. I'm based in Amsterdam, where I work for the International Secretariat, and there we follow, in particular, the EU politics, the legislation, the law, the EU directive that Maria Grazia already mentioned, and also Letizia, which is currently under review and revision. We follow at the moment at the daily level. But let me react to your presentations, both your presentations, although Maria Grazia and I spoke and we decided to focus on different issues. First of all, we recognize all the findings of the VULNER project, and we also fully agree with all the findings of the VULNER project. Because over the last 2 to 3 decades that we exist for 28 years, we have seen these gaps and challenges all over Europe, not only in the 3 countries that you focused on, but all over Europe we see the same gaps and challenges. Of course, there are some good models, some good best practices, but the gaps and the challenges remain. We do agree fully with the systematic character of labor exploitation all over Europe. We see that a lot of labor sectors are currently built on exploitation, systematic, as you said, fully relying on migrant workers, and fully also accepting that those migrant workers do not have the same labor standards as we all have, most likely those people here in the room. We see this underpayment, and I'm sure that the next speaker will also focus on this, but we see non-compliance with minimum wage, we see underpayment, we see very often not the last month to be paid, people being deported, returned without full payment. You already mentioned no access to back wages. All those issues we see, and we see that structural element, and we see it in a lot of sectors, as I mentioned already, the meat sector, construction, agriculture, a lot of legal regulated sectors, but also, of course, in the unregulated sectors, like, for example, domestic work, which is still not recognized as work today, even though so many people make use of au pairs and domestic workers in their houses, especially also in Brussels. We also agree with the lack of coordination, of course, and the lack of awareness and understanding, and the lack of safe reporting and complaint mechanisms, which is actually also what PICAM together with us is strongly advocating for. But I would like to highlight two issues that you mentioned in your recommendations, and two issues that we are at the moment very strongly advocating for. The first one is non-punishment. As we heard also from you today, is that a lot of people in Europe are still facing criminalization. They can still be detained, prosecuted, and punished for offenses they have compelled to commit in the course or as a result of having been trafficked, despite all the international and European legal binding standards in place, including the Council of Europe Convention, but also the EU Trafficking Directive, which clearly states in Article 8 not to punish victims of human trafficking. The problem with this is that even though it's so strongly embedded in legislation, it gives quite a lot of flexibility, and we see the same with the migration policies and asylum policies, but it gives quite a lot of flexibility to EU member states on how to implement this provision. Very positive is that a growing number of EU countries currently have specific legislation in place related to the non-punishment of victims of trafficking, in particular also for status offenses, and in some countries also there has been good guidance developed to how to apply the non-punishment provision, in particular, of course, for law enforcement and also prosecutors. However, often these provisions are not sufficiently known, and then I come again to your point of the lack of awareness. And again, and you stated it also several times, it's not very well implemented. And also what we see, they very often do not apply to all the unlawful acts. For example, they might only relate that people have maybe illegally crossed the country or irregularly stay, or some others. But if the crime is more severe, people are still punished even though they were forced to commit that crime as a victim of human trafficking. We are currently lobbying, I mentioned already, or advocating for stronger changes to the EU directive. For those of you who also follow, the Council report is now already out, the Parliament report is already out, and there will be MEPs proposing amendments coming week. So we're following it on a daily level, and we have been asking for stronger provision in this directive, stronger language to ensure the non-punishment provision. And I must say, we discussed it yesterday, Maria Grazia and I, we have been already a little bit successful, because at least there is some reference to that now in the EU Parliament report. It's not all good. You already mentioned the criminalizing of the knowingly use, which we also oppose, but at least on non-punishment, there is some recommendations of us that they took into account. What we want to see strengthened related to non-punishment is we want to have it for all the different crimes, also for severe crimes. We want to have it much earlier to be taken into account. The moment a person sees that this is a potential victim of human trafficking, immediately they should see, are there any fines imposed on the victim? Are there maybe still, is the victim maybe still in some procedures? Are there maybe criminal offenses against the victim? Then immediately these non-punishment provisions should apply. We also ask for much more training and awareness on this issue. And we ask also that all the sanctions against such a person are immediately cancelled. And that's also, again, related to your presentation. We ask that the non-punishment principle is not made conditional on the cooperation of the victim in the criminal investigation, prosecution, or trial. I'm conscious of the time, but I would also like to go into another issue that you raised, and that's the issue of remedies and compensation. We have been, for the last 10 years, very strongly advocating. We did a couple of projects to ensure that compensation is much more right that people can really access. Because in general, we see that it's very difficult to access compensation for various reasons. And these reasons are, again, the lack of awareness among police and the judicial system. Actually, I was recently at a training by ERA, the European Rights Academy, and there was a police person in the room, and I started to talk about compensation. And she said, actually working on human trafficking, she said, I never realized actually that a trafficked person could claim compensation. So sometimes you think we still have to do quite a lot on that. But we see that there's lack of awareness. We see that there are still a lack of legal aid, good expertise and legal aid provided. Very often victims of trafficking get pro bono lawyers who are maybe not specialized enough. We see the lack of information to victims that they can claim compensation, ask for compensation. If a person has no assistant, not an NGO or a very good lawyer to help and to assist them, then for sure you can forget about compensation. We also see that people, as we hear, everything is so dependent on criminal procedures. So if there's not a good investigation started, if the investigation is not successful, if there's no prosecution started, even if the prosecution is dissolved, then of course also the lack to access compensation is nearly not there, because you then have to start a civil claim, and it's very big burden also for victims. So what we are asking for is also a revision of Article 17 of the current trafficking directive. And we ask that all victims of human trafficking, regardless of their stay, regardless of the resident status, and also regardless of the form of exploitation, you see in practice that victims of sexual exploitation have a little bit more chance to get compensated, because sometimes it's very difficult to prove exploitation as being a violent crime. And so certain compensation funds do not often recognize them, or the eligibility criteria are very high. So we ask access for all the victims. We also see that a big burden is, of course, the lack of assets. There are hardly no assets or frozen from perpetrators, and then if there are no assets, very often victims hear, okay, then we cannot compensate you. What we want, and this is already practiced in the Netherlands, we want the states to pre-finance the compensation if the compensation is awarded in court, and then it's up to the state to get this money back from the perpetrators. And lastly, we also want fines, and I'm thinking that maybe you also will go into that. We see that very often companies who exploit people get away with fines to pay some cost, but not often pay the full back wages. We want that all those fines recovered by the Labor Inspectorate are also used to pay compensation to victims. I leave it here.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you for focusing the attention on the fact that the principle of no punishment is not really implemented. We have some legislation, such as the Italian legislation, where we don't have a specific provision on the principle of non-punishment. Other countries have, such as Belgium and Norway, but the way they applied it is, as you said, flexible, so they cover some illegal activities and not others. And then, of course, the importance, as you said, of the access to remedies and compensation. So now I give the floor to Enrico Somaglia. Thank you so much.
So, Suzanne, I'm afraid I'm the third Italian in the panel. I think we could have done better on that side, but good on gender equality, although I can feel a bit discriminated as well. But of course, I'm joking. So thank you very much for the invitation, Letizia. And I think it's a really an important discussion. And thank you for having HEFAT here, the European Federation of Food, Agriculture and Tourism Trade Unions that I represent. For us, it's an important topic, and it's important to share our view and to share also what the trade unions can do when it comes to human trafficking, when it comes to labor exploitation. EFAT represents workers and trade unions in extremely precarious sectors of the economy, agriculture, food processing, the meat sector, as you said, Suzanne, but also the domestic work sector. And these are sectors that rely a lot on mobile and migrant workers. And the reality of these workers is that a vast proportion of them indeed face discrimination, exploitation, and multiple obstacles in their way, in their path toward integration. And this is happening despite the fact that they play an essential role in our society, and this is happening despite the fact that they are key really for the sustainability of key sectors of the economy, not only the EFAT ones. your presentation was really excellent, and I think you have really highlighted the main shortcomings of the legal framework that we have. Not only the legal framework, but also the way member states implement the human trafficking directives, and I think also the employer sanctions directive, because there are major shortcomings also in that directive. And the main shortcoming, from my point of view, is really the lack of a human rights angle. So all these legal instruments are drafted, or in any case implemented, in a way to really push for more migration enforcement controls, and not really to protect the victim, the undocumented worker that has a reported violation of his rights, or the worker or the person that has been victim of human trafficking. And until this punitive approach is really not complemented by a human rights approach that put the person, the worker, at its center, that understand the vulnerabilities of the workers that has been victim of exploitation and the person that has been victim of human trafficking, then these directives, this legal framework will fail, I'm afraid. And the main, I think it's emblematic that you can find the number of workers that have been deported as a consequence of the fact that they have reported the violation of their rights, but actually you don't find the number of workers that receive their wages back. And this is also quite emblematic, again, of the fact that we are missing really this human rights angle, this human rights approach. I think the fact that we see how member states are using this instrument, or in general, the whole rhetoric around the migration to boost really the migration enforcement. We see it in concrete example. Think about what happened in Cutro in March. You know, there has been a boat that has sunk just a few meters in front of the Calabria region. And immediately the Meloni government, what said is, okay, we have to target the human traffickers. And this is, of course, is good. This is something that has to be done. But then is missing again the main issue, and it is the fact that we need to boost regular migration pathways, and we really need to have an inclusive vision, an inclusive EU vision on migration. I think this is really the main issues. It's very political, it's very complicated. We are in a dangerous period because the far right is advancing a bit everywhere. Also from Spain, probably we won't have very good news, I'm afraid, in July. And this is the case for my own government, Italy, but also in the Nordic regions. We saw how the far right is really using economic vulnerability of people to play workers once against each other, the national ones against the migrants. Also in a period where we lack workforce. Everybody's complaining, the employers are complaining about the lack of workforce, and at the same time we keep using the migrants identifying them as a threat and really playing workers once against each other. So the lack of an inclusive vision of migration for me is really one of the starting points, one of the main shortcomings. You know, there has been a deal yesterday, apparently, at the Home Affairs Council. I still need to read the details. I saw that the Meloni government was quite positive, which is not a good news. The Polish and the Hungarian government were were disappointed, which could be a good news, but we still have to see the details. But I think what it was extremely worrying is to see the proposal of the Swedish government on the table. So the proposal of the Swedish government on the table was to compensate those member states that do not want migrants to come into their territory with 20,000 euro per migrant. So we are really talking about human beings and monetarizing the human being. And this is really something which is completely not acceptable from my point of view. It's like we are talking about a cargo of fruits when we talk about real people that really come to the European Union with the hope of a better future. And what they find upon arrival, as we know, is most of the time discrimination and also sometimes labor exploitation. So we have, I think, to fight this rhetoric. I heard also an astonishing news. A policeman in the Nordic region of Spain, I think it was in the Basque region, that basically was compensating his colleagues, giving her more extra days for every migrant that had crossed the border with France in an illegal way. Yeah? So this is, again, we are getting used to this kind of news, and it's something that we really have to fight back, I think, also as NGOs, as academics, as trade unions. So to conclude, because I want to leave some space, I think we need to leave some space for the discussion as well. What to do? You have highlighted the very good policy recommendation. I think we really need a truly inclusive EU vision on migration, with harmonized access to work, as you have said, because a decent job is still one of the best ways to get fairly integrated into the society, and also to be able to escape from exploitation and also from any kind of violation of their rights. We need also probably harmonize the relocation mechanism, but in general we need also really access to decent jobs in an easy way. We need to boost the regular migration channels. That's absolutely important. From more a labor law perspective, I think we need to tackle those business practices that are becoming really more and more used by companies to exploit workers and migrant workers. I think about unregulated labor intermediaries, which most of the times is one of the root causes why we have also gang master practices, for example, in the south of Italy, or in Greece or in the south of Spain when it comes to the agriculture sector. We need to tackle abusive subcontracting practices, which is also one of the practices that affect more migrant workers, mobile workers. We saw it during COVID in Germany, for example, and how important it was to ban subcontracting in the German meat sector, because it really helped, in particular, migrant and mobile workers to have decent job and to really run away to exploitative practice. And then we need really to defend the principle that a worker is a worker, independently from his migration status or ethnic background. And from our point of view, that means, in particular, one thing, which is really putting some barriers between labor inspections and migration enforcement. So a worker who is undocumented and is working as domestic workers, as agricultural worker, needs to be able to report the violation of his rights without risking retaliation or deportation. And the same for a victim of human trafficking. And this is not yet the case. And we are trying to fight for it, for example, in the Platform Workers Directive. We try to include this principle already in a legal tool, because we know that platform workers, many are undocumented migrants as well. But it's very difficult to get it through. And of course, if I am a victim of human trafficking, if I am a worker which is facing exploitation and I'm reporting this, it has to be an easy reporting mechanism, not costly, and then I need to get a long-term visa. Because without that, then again, we don't ensure unconditional protection. So this is really one of the elements that we need to have. And last but not least, of course, we need to empower trade unions, but also NGOs that are on the ground, that are at the front line in the informal settlements. Our colleagues in Italy, in Spain, in Greece, they are doing an excellent job. They are in the informal settlements where migrant workers are. We have a lot of these informal settlements in Europe, unfortunately, which are completely a shame, I think, for the European Union, to have thousands of people living in overcrowded accommodation without electricity, without running water. But this is the case, and if you have the opportunity, go and see what it means. And really, we need to boost social dialogue, collective bargaining. During the 2015 and 16 migration we call it crisis, but we know it's a structural phenomenon. But the numbers, by the way, are similar to those to the 2015-2016, and Europe is once again not prepared, it seems. But during those years, social partners have really shown a great commitment in many countries, providing training, providing language courses, providing opportunities to get trainship and internship to migrant workers in many countries, in the Nordic regions in particular, but also in Austria, also in Italy, also in Germany. And this has shown, I think this has been really a good example, and we need to boost these good practices and ensure that really all the actors involved can really play an important role to tackle exploitation and human trafficking. So thank you very much. And
thank you, Enrico. Thank you, because you have really addressed several important points, such as I didn't mention the Employer Sanction Directive, which is something that should be stressed, as Enrico said. So the fact, first of all, that is, for instance, this instrument is not really an instrument that has been is considered and developed to protect the rights of workers, but to prevent irregular migration. So again, the border between where is the protection of the rights of the workers and the real aim, that is that to prevent and combat irregular migration, is always very, very unclear. And the other point that you mentioned that is really relevant, considering the Italian context, but I guess also in other European contexts, which is what I tried to stress at the beginning. So when I said we have to challenge all these dominant discourses, legal and policy discourses on trafficking and exploitation, they focus on some specific actors, such as traffickers, smugglers, or caporali in Italia, and is a way just to support a repressive approach, and not to focus on the root causes, and not to focus on the interplay of structural personal factors that create the situation of vulnerability of that person. And the last point that you mentioned, the fact that we have to support the role of NGOs and trade unions, is really relevant. It is something that I stress also in our report, because I really think that when we think about to adopt a social and human rights approach to address the situation of vulnerabilities of victims of trafficking and exploitation, NGOs, trade union should play a crucial role. And now we are really running out of time. We have time for one.
We started a little bit late, so
okay.
The coffee is brewing, but I think we have time for a question.
So if you have questions or comments, please share them.
Thank you. My name is Müge Dalkıran, and I'm a scholar from Turkey. I'm working on refugee protection in Greece and Turkey. You mentioned about the referral mechanism between asylum system and trafficking. I'm wondering if you can explain it more, because in Greece especially, the vulnerability assessment, unless it is something physical like pregnancy or physical disability, it can be done after the first interview, which can take months to take the first interview. And because of the lack of the legal aid in the first instance, in fact, usually asylum seekers who are also, who can also be trafficking victims, they do not know if they should bring it during the interview. So there can be many missing cases in this way. So how it is solved in this Italian case, or if it is possible in this referral mechanism? Thank you.
Maybe we can collect other questions or comments, if there are any.
Hi, my name is Vika. I'm from PAJOKE, one of the support organizations for human trafficking victims here in Belgium. I had a question for Enrico especially. You mentioned or at least we see the trade unions as a partner in recognizing victims of labor exploitation especially. And you mentioned the need to empower the unions on the ground. And I was actually wondering whether you experience any challenges, especially in access to mainly undocumented migrants as unions, and if you have any ideas or suggestions on how we can support trade unions to get better access to these groups of workers.
Yeah, okay. Does it work? Yes. So yes, we have experience, and there are a lot of good examples actually of trade union counseling services that support migrant workers and mobile workers, and of course among these workers there are also undocumented migrant workers. Very good example we have in Germany with Vermobilité, for example. I don't know if it's a project that you know, which is supported also by the government, because I think this is really an important work that trade unions do, and most of the time we do with the workers that at the end don't become trade union members, but nevertheless it is important that to stress the fact that trade unions fight for all workers. We do it when we do collective bargaining agreements, and we do it in this case as well, because at the end equal treatment is the ambition, is the objective. And therefore it makes very much sense, and one of our demands is also to have some structural funds from the European Union to support this kind of trade union counseling services. We do it in many other situations, many other contexts. It is not an easy job, and we do it in many cases in cooperation with NGOs. As I was mentioning before, we organize language courses, for example, in the informal settlements that we have in the south of Italy or in the south of Spain. It's not an easy job. We deal with people that are under threat, under discrimination, and that are... You need professionalism to do this kind of job, as you are professionals in your jobs as well. And I think we can have, if you want, a separate talks to assess country by country how we can put in touch also NGOs better with trade unions, but this is already happening. This is already happening in many situations, and I think it's an exercise that it's showing great potential, and it's really helping at the end in concrete terms workers, undocumented migrant workers, and vulnerable people in general.
Okay, thank you for your question. This referral coordination mechanism has been developed in Italy since 2017, thanks to some guidelines that UNHCR has developed in collaboration with the Italian government. And this mechanism, just to simplify the way it works, is that when doing the first interviews of the asylum seekers with the so-called commissioni territoriali, that means local commissions for the recognition of international protection. So when, during the first interview, local commission identify, recognize some indicators that can be connected to a person that can be a victim or a potential victims of trafficking and exploitation, the local commission may refer that person to the anti-trafficking system. That means that that person can receive adequate assistance, support, also in terms of accommodation. And the good thing of this model is the fact that in the last years has been also implemented in other contexts. So not only in the local commission, so during the first interview, but also in local tribunals. So when some judges understand that there are some indicators that can be connected to a victim or a potential victims of trafficking or labor exploitation, they might refer to the anti-trafficking. And plus, recently this system has been also applied, which is something very good, in some reception centers with the help of trade unions. So that means that trade union workers go to the reception centers, have sort of informal conversation with asylum seekers hosted there, and then if they identified some indicators, they might refer to anti-trafficking system. So it's a good model. It's a good model that, as I said, allows people to have adequate assistance and protection. And as a consequence of this, what we can say is that there has been an increase in the number of people that have been granted international protection or other forms of protection, including formal humanitarian protection and actual special protection. So this is very good. But at the same time, I have to stress there are many limitations as well. And one of these is that many victims, and this is something that really came out, for instance, as a result of our project, is that it's not so obvious that migrants themselves are able to navigate between these two systems, so anti-trafficking and asylum system. So if they are not supported in an adequate way, they can get lost in a way. And then the second point, which I think is the most dangerous one, is the fact that there has been many cases in which in the way local commissions and sometimes also tribunals assess the credibility and the vulnerability of the person, the victims of trafficking, although they are applying for asylum, is really connected again to the definition, to the indicators of victims of that specific crime. So that means if that person does not collaborate in criminal proceedings, the way the credibility of that person is not really considered as real. And again, is the problem that we mentioned several times, what can be the risks in terms of connection between a criminal law approach and when there is also the link between asylum system and anti-trafficking system. Thank you. Okay, so thank you so much.